Do a good job. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out. It's kind of raw and gray out there, so I'm grateful that you make the effort to join us this evening for this lecture. So you've heard about all the relationships with Julian and William and Jane and the Belgers. So I think this is either my second or third visit to Kansas City, so I'm not a pro yet on this fabulous cultural and historical city. But I'm thrilled to be back and thrilled to experience yet again this exquisite collection and the buildings and the talented staff that we've just heard from. So, here we go. So I want to begin with a full-throated laudatio to the collecting acumen and the extraordinary philanthropic engagement of Marion and Henry Bloch. I will go on to situate the Blochs in Kansas City with a few other collector philanthropists from U.S. cities, Dallas and Washington in particular, with whom I have had the pleasure to work, as well as other and related experiences in Europe. These stories will throw into context the Bloch gift of incredibly important Impressionist, post-Impressionist, and modernist work that have found a felicitous home at the Nelson-Atkins within the broader scope of the history of collecting, taste, and the impact of reception history on the shape of our public collections in the United States. And finally, I guess it's like a diptych, two parts to this talk. I want to suggest several strategies by which the 21st Century Museum may successfully meet the challenge and the opportunity of communicating to today's public the innovative, disruptive, creative voice of these late 19th and early 20th century artists that made their works of art paradigms of modernity. How do we capture and communicate that excitement to our audiences today? I'm so struck by the Bloch's, Mr. Bloch's articulation of values, and I'm quoting him. "I've tried to be a decent man, to be honest and to do the right thing." He knew that his family foundation could continue to advance the implementation of those values long after he was gone. The point is made by the foundation gift in 2019, months after his death, of $15 million to the University of Missouri, Kansas City, in support of the Bloch School of Management, supporting, as the foundation said, the belief in UMKC as a key engine for progress in the community they love, end of quote. I could go on to cite the other acts of impactful philanthropy, including to St. Luke's Neuroscience Center, but I hasten to turn to the museum and the Bloch building and the collection. The Stephen Hull designed 2007 building is a much-praised magical lantern of space for art, exhibitions, and convening people. So I'll only mention a handful of the brilliant works in the Bloch collection, spanning some 60 years, from the 1870s to the 1930s. I had the pleasure of having a bit of a tour with some of the curatorial staff today, and wonderful to see these magnificent works on the walls. Edward Manet's enigmatic 1871 The Croquet Party is a somewhat brooding scene of elegantly dressed bourgeoisie pursuing their match in less than ideal weather. The curious painting captures all of Manet's painterly elegance, but encompasses too the ambiguity and anguish of a nation just defeated in the Franco-Prussian War and whose capital, Paris, had been wrought by the rebellion of the Revolutionary Commune. By contrast, Gustave Caillebot's 1884 boating scene in Argenteuil on the River Seine is a scene of sunny calm, a picture that effortlessly encompasses burgeoning industry and newfound leisure activities in the Parisian suburbs. Camille Pissarro's 1898 Rue Saint-Honoré captures the urban landscape, viewed from his rented room in the Grand Hotel du Louvre, its architecture, the hub of pedestrian and vehicular activity, this intense animation captured with a brilliant painterly shorthand, mere smudges of paint in some passages. The Bloch collection encompasses the full variety of Impressionist and post-Impressionist subject matter. Edgar Degas' Dancer making a pointe, 1880, and Toulouse-Lautrec's Jean Avril looking at a proof, 1893, revealed a popularity of the world of the performer, the ballet, the dance hall, and cabaret. Both artists immersed themselves in these spheres of artistic activity. Degas was obsessed with the artifice and craft of the classical dancer. Toulouse was close friends with Jean Avril, a popular dancer and singer, here portrayed, joined in the artist's lithographic process, in the workshop, scrutinizing a trial proof. Vuillard's Woman in a Red Dress, circa 1900, shows an opera singer in an inscrutable pose, almost engulfed by the intense patterning of the intimate interior. Just about 30 years later, Pierre Bonnard's White Cupboard, I was sort of startled. You know, when you look at reproductions or these slides, you don't realize that's a big painting. This painting depicting a space within his house in Le Canet. The interior is an intricate puzzle of squares and rectangles, a tightly controlled composition that almost renders the figure irrelevant. So allow me to juxtapose this truly inspiring story of the Blochs and their collecting and philanthropy with a strikingly similar story that I experienced during my tenure as senior curator of painting and sculpture at the Dallas Museum of Art. The story of Margaret McDermott. These vignettes of other collectors are highly personal for me, perhaps as a fresh director emerita as of January 1. It's my moment to cast a retrospective glance. And it's very much rooted in my professional experiences. And this lecture would hardly be the moment for a systematic overview of the many families and their impact on the cities and public institutions in the US. So, the McDermotts. Margaret's husband, Eugene, was one of the founders of Texas Instruments, and he passed away very early in 1973. And she devoted her long life, she passed away in 2018 at the age of 106, to civic philanthropy. Her impact nourished, and it's so much like the story of the Blochs, her impact nourished the Symphony Hall, the Opera and Arboretum, UT Southwestern Medical School, University of North Texas, secondary schools, innumerable internships and fellowship programs. She loved nurturing young people. 3 monuments of contemporary design and engineering in the bridges, designed by Santiago Calatrava, and very significantly, her beloved Dallas Museum of Art. The McDermott Foundation endowed several major positions, including the director and all of the curators by the time I left, and often, and this, I tried this in DC, didn't quite work the same, but it might work here, often giving the naming right to the funding partner in the project. The foundation funded major collection acquisitions and the growth of entire areas of the permanent collection, contributing over 3,100 works of art. So for a curator, this was a dream, and at the same time, a hair-raising experience because of the rigorous vetting that Margaret required. Finally, upon her death, her painting collection, and I'm showing you, this is sort of album format, pictures that I took in her home. But upon her death, her painting collection found its home at the museum, integrated with the extant collection that she had had such a hand in forming as well. So I offer these few glimpses of Margaret, of her beloved pictures at home, and some of them as well on view at the DMA. You see Bonnard, Caillebotte, Degas, Bloch, and you see the parallels with the Bloch aesthetic here in Kansas City in terms of time period and artists, even analogous provenance, I discovered. Though Margaret ceased her private collecting in the 70s, while the Blochs were active collectors for an additional decade or two. During my tenure as, I just had to put this in because it was such a favorite in the living room. So for me, this is kind of a little poignant nostalgia journey of spending teas, drinks, lunch, and dinner at Margaret's house. But during my tenure as director of the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., I had the profound pleasure of working very closely with Vicki and Roger Sant. Vicki had served earlier as the museum's first non-Phillips family president and chair. Vicki had adopted the museum, that was her word, when she had first moved to D.C., serving first as a docent and a volunteer, and years later devoting newfound wealth to a transformative new addition to the museum, the Sant building, providing the Phillips with sorely needed essential functions such as a library, an auditorium, classrooms, expanded exhibition space. Sometimes I'm so grateful to my predecessor for having shepherded that difficult project into an adjacent townhouse to the Phillips Collection on 21st and Q Street. Vicki began to collect seriously, and especially under the tutelage of one of my predecessor, Impressionist scholar Charles Moffat. Vicki had been impressed by the intimate interiors and domestic scenes of Vuillard and Bonnard that Duncan Phillips so favored. She and her husband ultimately amassed a highly focused collection of works by the late 19th century Nabi paintings, all curated with the idea of the Phillips collection being their ultimate home. It was an enormous honor to work with them to achieve a glorious exhibition in 2019, and you're seeing the cover of the catalog. Sadly, it was installed after Vicki's untimely death, and the entire project gives fresh scholarship to the collection, celebrates the promised gift that will come to the museum in the fullness of time. And just one more, it's not this big, but a large-scale screen by Bonnard, which is just a knockout and simply stunning. Also, while at the Phillips, I was able to bring my curatorial experience from Switzerland, where I'd lived for more than a dozen years before my Dallas sojourn, to our exhibition roster. I had invested considerable research and scholarship into the great Swiss collectors of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, a reception history of sorts that took focus in a major 1995 exhibition, this is while I was in Switzerland, at the Royal Academy in London, in collaboration with my dear colleagues Joachim Pizarro and Marianne Stevens. That project, my work in the Kunstmuseum in Basel, and friendships with local collectors allowed for this unusual opportunity to feature two glorious private collections housed in the Basel Art Museum for temporary exhibition in Washington for me. It was actually a funny experience of just that Visiting in Basel, someone calling across a crowded room and saying, "Dorothy, I have to have a conversation." And 15 minutes later, there was this great handshake, and resulting in what was a grand exhibition. The parallels between collecting history in Switzerland and in the United States is actually very rich and interesting. It was earlier in Switzerland, but in both cases, a phenomenon resulting from new wealth, resulting from industrial and technological innovation, and manifesting in sophisticated art collections, and a fierce devotion to the public museums in those individuals' hometowns. For the German-speaking collectors from the industrialized cities of the northeast of the country, including Basel, Winterthur, and Zurich, their newfound taste for the French avant-garde, Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, was a reflection of a new era, an aspiration for modernity, a progressive and idealistic faith in the present and future of these, and these are the collectors of these physicians, engineers, industrialists, and entrepreneurs, an international outlook as an alternative to earlier, more shuttered nationalistic chauvinism. This optimism was shattered by the trauma of the First World War, but the taste for French art was well established on an international stage. So what I'm showing you here, so the two collections were the Stechlin and Im Obersteg collections. I don't think either of them had ever traveled abroad and not together, and they were filled with Cézannes and Renoirs and Pissarros and Gauguins. And I'm showing you two of the collectors' homes on the right, and you get a glimpse of Picasso and Renoir and Pissarro. I want to offer yet another chapter from my work with private collections. My 5 or 6 years, during 5 or 6 years of my sojourn in Switzerland, I served as curator of the Douglas Cooper collection of Cubist art. The evolution of this enormously important collection and its fate is entirely different than those I've discussed thus far, and I find it a very edifying contrast. Douglas Cooper, and you see him almost obscured by the candelabra in the center of the photo on the left. You see Picasso and Cocteau on his right. You see Michel Leiris, and I think that's Jacqueline Picasso on the other side of the table. Cooper was an eminent art historian, a curator, and a collector, and he was based in his early years in London. His focus was on Picasso, Bloch, Gris, and Léger, mostly, and he termed them in his books as the true Cubists. His approach was in-depth and scholarly, and he also knew well many of the artists themselves, as you see here in this photo. And what we're seeing here, and it's inscribed for Douglas Cooper from his friend Picasso, and it shows an array of the many Fernand Léger masterworks on the wall behind them at this grand, very boozy dinner in the 50s at his chateau in the south of France. Cooper, whose family had amassed some significant wealth in Australia with sheep dip, always felt the outsider in London society, whether because of his background or his homosexuality. After World War II, Cooper decamped to his Chateau de Castille in this remote village in Provence, where he held court. He never had the wealth of the successful industrialists I've mentioned. He never had the deep civic pride of those individuals either. And he began to sell parts of his collection during his lifetime. More was dispersed after his death. The heartening news is that over a dozen major works came to form the core of the then burgeoning collection of Leonard Lauder, whose bequest of his Cubist collection many years later in 2013 to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York is surely transformative. It's rather magical from my perspective, having studied the evolution, growth, and disposition of the private collection, this circuitous but happy story in the life of these pictures in finding a home in the public domain. We know it doesn't always work out this way, and we could consider, and I decided that was not a chapter for my talk tonight, we could consider the sale in recent years of the Dallas collection of Ed Cox, or the Gantz collection, or Hester Diamond's collection, to name just a few. And I mention this chapter because from my point of view, it gives me even deeper appreciation of the civic pride and the philanthropic engagement of these collectors like the Blochs. So another, oh, actually, I should have said on the right was Douglas's home later in Monaco. So you're seeing in his libraries, obviously not a grand chateau, so he had to hang the pictures over his library, but you see, in this case, some of his Picassos, and some of those works indeed went into Leonard Lauder's collection and ultimately in his bequest to the Met. So another and different phenomenon is, of course, the private collection becomes a public museum. Fairly recent examples include the Ronald Lauder, the other brother, collection in the Neue Gallery in New York, the Nasher Sculpture Center in Dallas, the Pulitzer Museum in St. Louis, the Broad Collection in Los Angeles, Glenstone outside of DC, the very new Rubel Museum now in DC as well as Miami. But this is not exclusively a contemporary phenomenon, as, however, if one considers the emergence of the great public collections of modern art in this country in the early decades of the 20th century. For instance, MoMA, the Whitney, the Barnes, and ta-da, the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C. So you're seeing some historic photos of Marjorie and Duncan in their youth and in their later years. And I hope you'll indulge me and understand why, at this moment, I want to focus on the Phillips, the museum that I shepherded as director for 15 years. In brief, Duncan and Marjorie established their fast-growing private collection of 19th and 20th century European and American art as a public charity in the 1897 house, there it is, that was Duncan's boyhood home on Q and 21st in Northwest Washington. The Phillips Memorial Gallery was opened to the public in 1921, a project inspired by Duncan's crippling grief at the loss of his father, and then just months later, the death of his brother James in the influenza pandemic. How very strange and disconcerting, I have to tell you, that we celebrated our 100 years of the Phillips collection in 2021 in the midst of our pandemic, giving poignant corroboration to our work in art and wellness and to our conviction in the power of art to have a transformative impact in our lives. That was the beginning of Duncan and Marjorie's museum, and it's what we try to live up to today. So you're seeing the house on the corner, obviously, and oh, that's not my horse and carriage. So it's an archival photograph. I love the photo at the bottom. Everybody wants to forget that in the 1950s, 60s, the annex that Duncan chose to build was a high, modern, international-style modernist building, which was subsequently, when the annex was enlarged in the 80s, was made bigger, but then mysteriously clad over in a kind of faux Georgian. But it's important for me to keep this in mind because it shows the kind of risk-taking, forward-thinking collecting and view of art and the world that Duncan Phillips clung to in the very final years of his life. And we do try to live up to that. So now if you enter the annex, the museum, you'll find still this wonderful artist, Victor Ekpuk's, one of our 4 centennial commissions of site-specific work that greet you and announce, this is about art. Duncan Phillips collected knockout masterworks of Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, and Modernism. And here you saw some of them. Chardin, Corot, Daumier, the famous Renoir Luncheon of the Boating Party. He made the case that American modernism, oops, let me just rest there, held its own against the Europeans and supported those artists' careers and collected their art vigorously. He was very attuned to the artist's practice, perhaps because Marjorie was a painter, and fostered a notion that we should all, quote, see beautifully as artists see. Most invigorating and challenging for me as the director in the 21st century, Duncan described his project as an intimate collection combined with an experiment station. You see his boldness, as I mentioned, with that extension, but also in the later years of his life, with the annex, but also with his collecting of these glorious, and you won't see only 3 out of the 4 glorious, radiant paintings by Mark Rothko. The only room that the artist lived to see, and the artist prescribed the lighting conditions, which is never as bright as what you see in this slide, and the height of the hang and the furniture, and the shape of the room. It is a lot to live up to. And I juxtapose this with, in a sense, Wolfgang Leib's answer to the contemplative, meditative environment of the Rothko room. So in 2013, my then deputy director for curatorial and academic affairs, Klaus Ottmann, who is an expert on Wolfgang Leib, proposed that we should meet with this distinguished artist from Germany and India, and that we should commission a site-specific permanent project. We proposed galleries and corridors, and he chose what truly, it was a broom closet, truly. It's very small, very intimate. It's clad. Your museum has this beautiful Italian wall surfacing. One wants to just caress it. Well, when one walks into the Wolfgang Leib beeswax chamber, you want to stand there and inhale the perfume of this beeswax that the artist himself helped to harvest and assemble in his estate in southern Germany. So this is an example of our experimentation. And I was very surprised, I'll be frank, that our trustees and arts committee was so enthusiastic about this rather provocative work. It is precisely our pursuit to embrace the mandate for experimentation that guides me now during this talk in sharing around a half dozen strategies that we have used to enliven and enlarge the way in which we frame and present the great Impressionist works that are in our care. After all, is it not our responsibility to convey to today's visitors and students the sheer excitement of the painters themselves and the eagerness of the early collectors who saw the subject matter and the stylistic innovation as the embodiment of a new modern economic and social order, an optimistic expression of the future? And what's our risk if we neglect this challenge? That these collections recede as inert relics of an elite, maybe inscrutable, wealthy, rising middle class. I think that really is our responsibility to embrace and frame these works at the Nelson-Atkins, at the Phillips, and other museums in a very bold and lively way. So, one fundamental strategy has been the intense collaboration of curator and conservator in probing the works to uncover the techniques and aesthetic intent of the artist. As I already mentioned, Edgar Degas was preoccupied with the ballet dancer, with the body in repose, in awkward extension, in distorted postures, in endless repetition and alteration of postures. The great large-scale canvas of the two dancers at the bar, and you see it in the West parlor at the Phillips, flanked left and right by American modernists. And I show you on the right a little smidget of the conservation curatorial work that produced a full-scale exhibition. Degas made changes over and over again. Some of them are visible to the naked eye. Examination with infrared reflectography and X-radiography reveals an almost manic revisionism in greater detail. He works and reworks the position of the dancer's legs more than 5 times. The left dancer's arm, tucked behind her back, has also been revised. We see him scrape away paint near the right dancer's neck to enhance her position. A careful study of a related work from a couple of years later, around 1900, at the National Gallery of Canada, also with the help of infrared imaging, reveals further a sequence of rethinking and change between the oil and the pastel. This forensic deep dive allows us to be inside the artist's head, inside his decision-making, his choices, his obsessions, his techniques. The viewer accompanies Degas in the studio. It resonates today because revision, repetition, variation on a theme, and experimentation in many media are, after all, characteristics of contemporary artistic practice. One more foray into intense study with advanced conservation techniques was with our 2022 exhibition, Picasso Painting the Blue. The project began with our Blue Room from 1901, and the clear evidence that something lurked beneath the surface. This was noted already in the 1950s, and then further revealed in X-ray examination. However, during the last 15 years, our conservators worked with colleagues at multiple institutions, but especially and exceptionally with colleagues at the National Gallery across town from us, who have the capacity to carry out cutting-edge examinations with multispectral imaging and reflectance imaging spectroscopy, I had to write that out, to reveal pigment distribution that is in the underlying surfaces. And in the autumn of 2012, we had the opportunity for the picture to be scanned by the exceptionally sensitive prototype Maya X-ray detector at Cornell's high-energy synchrotron source, CHESS. Finally, the project unfolded as a partnership with the Art Gallery of Ontario with 2 major pictures from this period, and extended across Europe and Asia with the intense examination of many works, revealing their secrets for the first time. So what you're seeing here, if you turn your head to the left, you see that under the bather and the tub is that portrait. And then we turn it by 180 degrees, and you see what a finished painting it was indeed. What began as mere suspicions, and I should show you here is one of the pictures from Ontario with what was revealed, the changes, a third figure that was eradicated, the clarification of the hands and the passing of this sort of ceremonial passing of this bowl of soup. What began as mere suspicions of vague X-ray images emerged as fully recognizable paintings beneath the painting, intriguing objects beckoning to be deciphered and identified. Alterations in compositions shows Picasso's movement from genre scene to hieratic, theatrically symbolic images. Once again, this collaborative detective work brings us inside the artist's studio, his practice, his mind. This was a period of quick growth and change for the young artist, moving between Barcelona and Paris, a new world of images, places, friends, and acquaintances being superimposed over old, a moment of fluid change that catapults him forward to a succession of rich, sometimes contradictory phases of artistic expression. No wonder this exhibit was named one of the best in 2022 by the Wall Street Journal. I threw in this photograph, which harkens back to a curatorial project of mine, The Artist and the Camera. This is an anonymous photo of Picasso in his studio, but you see this superimposition collage technique. It was permeating that period and the way of thinking and working. So a disarmingly simple strategy, so I'm moving on to another strategy, is to reveal the narrative fully in all of its rich detail. In 2017, we turned our focus to the almost too loved Renoir Luncheon of the Boating Party. This work, purchased for a record-breaking $125,000 in 1923, from the hugely influential dealer Durand-Ruel, was Duncan Phillips's self-proclaimed Mona Lisa, the anchoring masterwork of his collection. This multi-figured outdoor genre scene on a grand scale, resembling a history painting, celebrating the fluid mix of society in the late 19th century Paris. It shows its actresses, its restaurateurs, its collectors, models, painters, boating enthusiasts, singers, and writers, all brought around this brilliant luncheon table outdoors on the Seine, presumably a weekend outing from the city. It is quintessentially the celebration of modern life. So our visitors loved getting to know all of the players, the son and daughter. And what you see on the right is actually a photo from Durand-Ruel's archive, which started to identify who all these folks were. We see the son and daughter of the restaurateur. We learn more about Aline Charigot. She's the lady with the bonnet and the pooch. Only the French put their dogs on the table. Who later became his wife. We learn about his fellow painter, Gustave Caillebotte, who was also a great boating enthusiast. We learn about the restaurant Fournaise. We learn about the actress, Hélène André, and we see her portrayed in other artists' work. There was the opera singer, there was the Baron Raoul Barbier, a young journalist. It's actually fascinating, but for me the best was the guy in the background with the top hat, Charles Efroussi. He was a collector, he was a publisher, he was a writer, and you'll get to know him and his family if you read or have read that fabulous book by Edmond de Waal, The Hare with the Amber Eyes. If you haven't, run and get a copy. The hare is a netsuke, a little Japanese carving that was in the family and went from Odessa to Paris to Vienna and ultimately Japan and now London. And it was in Efroussi's collection. So I really do recommend that. Even more intriguing, Efroussi was purportedly the model for Proust's character of swan in remembrance of things past. Our most recent exhibition at the Phillips, so here's another strategy, and I guess that was my swan song as director, was devoted to an artist and the question of, why don't we know this guy? Why don't we know about Giuseppe de Nittis, who exhibited in the first Impressionist show in 1874, and who was very close friends with Caillebotte, Degas, and Manet, among others. This was an opportunity for curators and art historians of today to question our script that we all have been following as art historians, to question the canon and introduce our audiences to new talent, new people. And the rewards are manifold. What you're seeing on the left is a close-up of the catalog cover. We discover new perspectives on the parks and street scenes, races, and entertainment of French society. There are images of traumatized Paris following France's defeat in the war, severely destroyed or damaged monuments. We discover de Nittis, the experimenter, in the French countryside or the more remote territories of southern Italy. He was fascinated by smoke, by the new forms of transportation, by spewing lava, bursting steam from Mount Vesuvius in Naples. We discover his adoring wife and dutiful model, Leontine, portrayed in these images by his friends, by Manet and Degas. And he was, moreover, a huge aficionado of Japanese painting. He owned about 300 works of Japanese painting. He took lessons from Setai, and here you see him experimenting with painting on silk. It's interesting that Ephrussi, of course, was a great collector of all things Japaniste as well. The final strategy I want to explore is perhaps the most powerful: enabling the voice of the contemporary artist to interface, interrogate, and appropriate the works of the Impressionists we love so very well, to offer us new perspectives, to borrow Phillips's phrase, to see as artists see. So we initiated a series of projects entitled Intersections, starting way back in 2009. So during our 100th anniversary in 2021, we were approached by the British op art doyenne, Bridget Riley. And she wanted to work on Renoir's Luncheon of the Boating Party, which I found a startling idea. So she wrote an essay for our centennial catalog, which was called Seeing Differently. Who would have thought that a 1985 Hayward Gallery Renoir exhibit in London had had such a profound impact on artists of her generation? Or that her encounter with the Luncheon of the Boating Party, and I'm quoting her, presiding over the exhibition, was so important to her. So I quote just a couple of lines from her essay. Renoir was passionately interested in all matters of color. I was enthralled by his use of red, one of the most difficult colors for a painter, by virtue of its strength. He takes red through every possible modulation and every shade of light and dark, using it as contrast or harmony. The red movement in the Luncheon of the Boating Party supports the network of sightlines and glances, tiny touches picking up lips, scarves, artificial flowers, ribbons, and trimmings carry red into the depth of the picture plane, returning it by way of the subdued striping in the awning above to the foreground of the viewer's gaze, end quote. What a fabulous window into how an artist sees and learns. So you're seeing, so she said she wanted to follow it up with an installation. You're only seeing one of 4 works in this little gallery. I have to say, I was greeted with a little bit of consternation by these juxtapositions of her very rigid op art inspired painting. But I love, as Duncan Phillips did, the opportunity to really see through her eyes. It helped me, I have to say, I probably after all this time developed a slight allergy to the luncheon of the boating party. Everybody loves it so well that for me this was like a tonic. It just sort of cut through and opened up a new doorway of access for me. Just 2 weeks before the pandemic closed us all down, we had opened an exhilarating exhibit entitled Rifts and Relations, a project that I had commissioned from an esteemed art historian, Dr. Adrian L. Childs. I don't use the word exhilarating lightly. If you've been in the business a long time, it has to really be something that grabs you, to use that word. I learned so much from the brilliant juxtapositions in this project and from the strength of each artist's call and response with the European predecessor. The cover of the catalog, and you're seeing a version here, features a work by Faith Ringgold, a 1991 work entitled Picasso's Studio, that forges a dialogue with and defies the heroic mythology of Picasso. The work, by the way, is in the collection of the Worcester Art Museum. Ringgold's alter ego, Willia Marie Simone, dominates the canvas, takes over Picasso's studio, seems to invade his Demois d'Avignon masterwork. Ringgold's work is framed with a series of texts which you won't be able to decipher. They're there in sort of the little calligraphic elements. And they challenge Picasso's interaction with and his appropriation and understanding of the cultures of Africa. It is as though the depicted masks speak for the African people. Europeans discovered your image as art at the same time they discovered Africa's potential for slavery and colonization, her text says. Picasso is enthralled with African masks. He was mesmerized. Ringgold is more interested in the mask as an expression of a culture in which she partakes and that she is determined to reappropriate. This juxtaposition brought together the National Gallery of Art's glorious Claude Monet, 1876, Woman with a Parasol, Madame Monet and her son, part of the Paul Mellon bequest, and a 2012 painting by the noted contemporary painter Titus Kaphar. Kaphar, a recipient in 2018 of a prestigious MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant, reconfigures and regenerates the most beloved art historical paintings and insists on questioning, on reminding us of African American subject matter. The transformation here of the transcendent light-filled sky in the Monet into a dense, black expanse of tar is entirely devoid of light. This simple reversal or inversion allows us to simultaneously appreciate the ethereal radiance of the Monet while beginning to question who is absent in these works, who is the focal point, and why not? So one of the glories of the Phillips collection you see on the left is Henri Matisse's interior with the Egyptian curtain, painted in 1948. And Phillips acquired it 2 years later. That was one of the hallmarks. He acquired it the same year, the year later. So the artist on the right, the artist Janet Taylor Pickett, has long adored Matisse's daring use of color and his lively line. She was also fascinated by Matisse's deep appreciation of the objects within his domestic space, textiles, screens, furniture, and how he transformed the ordinary within the artifice of his artistic realm. Matisse created an artistic transformation of the domestic setting. He was an avid collector of textiles. The Egyptian material he depicts is a kayamiya, an applique traditionally used to adorn a tent. In parallel fashion, Taylor Pickett manipulates images of traditional decorative body embellishments and botanical fashions worn by nomadic Surma and Mursi tribes in Eastern Africa. Her work, like Matisse's, is deeply personal, exuberant, and self-confident. Taylor Pickett's work was one of several that the Phillips collection purchased from this important exhibit to add to our permanent collection. There are other works, including site-specific projects. I mentioned Victor Ekpuk's right at the outset about the Phillips collection, that were commissioned to celebrate the centennial. Some were purchased from a regional juried invitational project, Inside, Outside, Upside Down. That was a good title, I thought, for anything going on in 2020 and 21. But it offered the museum an opportunity to celebrate not so much itself, but its community, to reach outside the walls and to invite the creative community inside. It was so fabulous, and it was a very nutritious success. So I want to conclude with a work that is summative of our efforts to animate the permanent collection and connect it in the most dynamic ways to today. Several members of the Phillips community witnessed the stunning projection on the facade of the Prado Museum in Madrid in 2019, celebrating that museum's 200th anniversary. That wonderful experience generated the idea of commissioning the Spanish artist Daniel Canogar to create a similar work to mark our important 100th anniversary. The result that you see here is called amalgama, a manipulation of image fragments from hundreds of works of the permanent collection, a digital liquefaction into an algorithmically ever-changing stream that celebrates and transforms the collection and makes it continuously alive. It is glorious, intoxicating, and engaging, and people get mad when we don't have it up all the time. So that's good news, right? So what could be a better fulfillment of our charge as stewards of great collections than to fire the imagination, foster engagement, induce intellectual and artistic contention, and most of all, to invite joy. So it's given me a lot of joy that you've joined me tonight, and I truly am grateful for your kind attention. Thank you so much.